Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I have something truly chilling in store for you. We're diving into a series of 5 eerie and unsettling horror encounters from the world of nursing. Each story comes from a brave nurse who has faced unimaginable situations in the dead of night, from haunted hallways to sinister whispers and hidden secrets. These tales will make you question what might be lurking in the shadows of the places we trust the most. So, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the darkest corners of the healthcare world. Let's begin. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Sarah, and I've been a nurse for nearly a decade. In all those years, I've seen my fair share of strange things. Things that could easily be explained by stress, lack of sleep, or the simple quirks of working in a hospital. But what happened during my night shift at the old wing of St. Margaret's Hospital is something I'll never forget. It was the night I questioned everything I thought I knew about the world. St. Margaret's was built in the early 1900s and had undergone several renovations over the years. However, the old wing, where I was assigned that fateful night, hadn't been used much since the newer sections of the hospital were built. It was mostly used for storage and occasionally for overflow patients when the main wards were full. I was told that the old wing was a quiet place, and since there were only a few patients, I thought it would be an easy shift. I arrived at the hospital a little before my shift started at 7 p.m. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the hospital's courtyard. As I walked into the old wing, I noticed how eerily quiet it was compared to the rest of the hospital. The floors creaked under my feet, and the dim yellow lighting only added to the unsettling atmosphere. I was assigned to care for 3 patients that night. The first was Mr. Thompson, an elderly man in his late 82s who had been admitted for pneumonia. He was stable but needed regular monitoring. The second was Mrs. Green, a middle-aged woman recovering from surgery. The third patient was in isolation, and I was warned that she was in a delicate state both physically and mentally. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. I checked on Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Green, ensuring they were comfortable and their vitals were stable. Around 9 p.m. I made my way to the isolation room. The patient, Ms. Emily Warren, had been admitted a few days earlier. She was in her early 40s and had been suffering from severe depression and anxiety. The doctors suspected she might have attempted to harm herself, but the details were unclear. As I approached her room, I felt a cold draft despite the warm summer night. The door to her room was slightly ajar, and I could hear faint whispers from inside. I hesitated for a moment, thinking maybe one of the other nurses was already in there. But when I peeked inside, I saw that the room was empty except for Ms. Warren, who was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I introduced myself softly and asked her how she was feeling. She didn't respond at first, her eyes still fixed on a spot on the ceiling. I followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual. Finally, she turned her head toward me and whispered, "Do you hear them?" "Hear what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The voices, they never stop talking. They tell me things, terrible things." A shiver ran down my spine. I had dealt with patients suffering from mental health issues before, but something about the way she spoke unsettled me. I reassured her that she was safe and that I was there to help. She simply nodded and closed her eyes, as if retreating into herself. As I left the room, I could shake the feeling that something was off. The whispers she mentioned. I hadn't heard anything, but the way she described it made my skin crawl. I brushed it off as exhaustion on her part and continued with my duties. The night went on, and the hospital grew quieter. Around midnight, I was making my rounds again when I heard a strange noise coming from the isolation room. It sounded like soft sobbing, but there was something distorted about it, almost like it was coming from multiple voices at once. I rushed to Miss Warren's room, fearing she was having some sort of breakdown. When I opened the door, the room was dark except for the faint glow of the monitors. Miss Warren was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open, staring directly at me. Her face was pale and her lips were trembling. "They're here," she whispered. "They've come for me." Before I could respond, the room grew icy cold and the lights flickered. The monitors began to beep erratically, and I saw Miss Warren's heart rate spike. I ran to her side, trying to calm her down, but she was unresponsive, her eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned to see what she was looking at, but there was nothing there, just the empty, dark corner of the room. But then I felt it, a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. The air felt heavy, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I quickly paged the on-call doctor, fearing that Miss Warren was going into cardiac arrest. As I waited, the whispers Miss Warren had mentioned earlier filled the room. They were faint, almost indistinguishable, but they were there, surrounding us. The doctor arrived within minutes, and as soon as he stepped into the room, the temperature returned to normal, the lights stopped flickering, and the whispers ceased. Miss Warren's vitals stabilized, but she remained catatonic, her eyes glazed over. The doctor examined her and decided she needed to be transferred to the psychiatric ward immediately. As they prepared to move her, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. I wanted to leave that room, that wing, and never return. But my shift wasn't over, and I still had other patients to care for. As the night went on, the eerie feeling lingered, but nothing else unusual happened. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Before I left, I checked on Miss Warren one last time. She had been moved to the psychiatric ward during the night, but when I asked about her condition, the nurse on duty simply shook her head. "She's not responding to anything," she said. "It's like she's completely shut down." I left the hospital that morning with a heavy heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened in that room, something beyond our understanding. And as I walked to my car, I couldn't help but glance back at the old wing, half expecting to see a shadowy figure in one of the windows. That was my last shift at St. Margaret's. I requested a transfer to a different hospital shortly after, and I've never looked back. But even now, years later, I still think about Miss Warren and those whispers. I still wonder what it was that she heard, what it was that we all felt that night, and I pray that I'll never have to experience anything like it again. My name is Emily, and I've been a nurse for over 12 years. In that time, I've worked in various wards, from pediatrics to the emergency room. But it was my stint in the hospice care unit that left an indelible mark on my soul. The experiences I had there made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. I had been transferred to the hospice care unit in the summer of 2018. The unit was located in the hospital's oldest wing, a place that had seen countless patients pass through its doors, many of whom never left. The walls were a dull, faded green, and the floors were polished to a high shine that couldn't quite mask the sense of decay that lingered in the air. The smell of antiseptic mingled with something else, something more ancient and foreboding, something that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. Hospice care is a place where the dying come to spend their final days in comfort, and I was prepared for the emotional toll it would take. What I wasn't prepared for were the things I would witness during those long, quiet nights. There was a certain stillness in the hospice wing, a stillness that went beyond the usual quiet of a hospital at night. It was a silence that seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, as if the very air was waiting for something to happen. The hospice ward was always silent, save for the occasional beeping of monitors or the quiet shuffle of feet as the night shift staff went about their duties. The ward was divided into individual rooms, each occupied by a patient nearing the end of their life. Most nights were routine, filled with the gentle care and compassion that these patients deserved. But there was one patient, Mr. Grayson, who was different. Mr. Grayson was an elderly man in his 92s, a former war veteran with no family left to visit him. He had been in the hospice for a few weeks, and his condition was steadily declining. He was a quiet man, rarely speaking, but when he did, it was usually to mumble something incoherent. The other nurses said he was seeing things, that his mind was slipping away as death drew closer. But I noticed something else. He seemed genuinely terrified. The fear in his eyes was palpable, a raw, primal fear that shook me to my core. It was unlike anything I had ever seen in my years as a nurse. Patients often fear death, of course, but this was different. This was a fear not just of dying, but of something more, something unseen that was waiting for him on the other side. It started on a Tuesday night, during my usual rounds. I entered Mr. Grayson's room to check on him, and as I approached his bed, I noticed that he was trembling, his eyes wide with fear. His breathing was shallow, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the room. "Mr. Grayson," I said softly, "it's just me, Nurse Emily. How are you feeling?" He didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on something in the corner of the room. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the shadows cast by the dim lamp on his bedside table. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, darker, as if they were absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. "They're coming," he finally whispered, his voice trembling. "Who's coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though my heart was beginning to race. "The shadows. They're coming for me. They've been waiting for me." I felt a chill run down my spine. I heard stories of patients seeing loved ones or even angels before they passed, but this was different. There was no peace in his words, only dread. I tried to reassure him, telling him that he was safe and that the shadows were just figments of his imagination, but he shook his head vehemently, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "You don't understand," he rasped, his eyes wild with fear. "They're real. They've been waiting for me since the war, and now they're here." I stayed with him for a while, holding his hand until he eventually fell asleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to his words than just the ramblings of a dying man. The next few nights were uneventful, but I noticed that Mr. Grayson grew more and more agitated as the days went by. He would mutter to himself, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something, or someone. The other nurses dismissed it as delirium, but I couldn't help but feel that there was something else at play. On one particularly quiet night, I found myself drawn to his room, unable to shake the feeling that I needed to check on him. As I entered, I was struck by how cold the room had become. It was the middle of summer, and the rest of the ward was comfortably warm, but Mr. Grayson's room felt like a freezer. I could see my breath in the air, a thin mist that hung in front of my face like a ghostly veil. Mr. Grayson was lying in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, as if he was trying to scream but couldn't find the breath to do so. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mr. Grayson, can you hear me? What's wrong?" His eyes slowly moved to meet mine, and I saw something in them that made my blood run cold. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resignation, a deep, abiding sense of acceptance that chilled me to my core. "They're here," he whispered, so softly that I had to lean in to hear him. "They've come for me." Before I could respond, the lights in the room flickered, plunging us into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, the shadows in the room seemed to have grown, creeping along the walls like living things. I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the shadows, and the oppressive silence. But I could feel it, something watching us, something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to get out of that room, to run as far away as I could, but I couldn't leave Mr. Grayson alone. Not like this. "I'm here with you, Mr. Grayson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're not alone." His gaze softened, and for a moment the fear seemed to drain from his face. He looked almost peaceful, as if my presence had given him some small measure of comfort. But then, just as quickly, the terror returned, his eyes widening in horror. "Behind you," he gasped, his voice barely more than a breath. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, darker than they should have been, moving in ways that defied logic. I felt the room growing colder, the shadows pressing in on us, and I knew, deep down, that we were not alone. In the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to coalesce, forming a shape, a figure that was tall and thin, its edges indistinct and wavering like smoke. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unfeeling, as if it was studying me, waiting for something. I backed away slowly, my hand still gripping Mr. Grayson's. His skin was ice cold, his grip weak but desperate. He was trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Please," he whispered, his voice shaking, "don't let them take me." I wanted to help him, to protect him, but I didn't know how. I was just a nurse, trained to heal and care for the living. This was something beyond my understanding, something I had never encountered before. The figure in the shadows didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, the air around us growing colder and more oppressive. I could barely breathe, the weight of the presence pressing down on me like a physical force. "Emily." The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. It was my name, spoken in a voice that was not Mr. Grayson's, a voice that was deep and resonant, echoing in the small room. I turned back to Mr. Grayson, but his eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. The fear had drained from his face, replaced by a look of peace, as if he had finally accepted his fate. I watched in horror as the shadows in the room began to close in around him, swirling like a dark mist, enveloping his frail body. I tried to pull him back, to keep him from whatever was coming, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, too relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The room was still, the shadows gone, the coldness lifted. Mr. Grayson lay in his bed, still and silent, his hand limp in mine. His face was peaceful, serene, as if he had simply fallen asleep, but I knew better. I knew that something had come for him, something from beyond, something that had been waiting for him all these years. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't finished. I stayed with him for a while longer, my heart heavy with sorrow and fear. When I finally left the room, the hallway outside was eerily quiet, the lights flickering softly as if the hospital itself was breathing a sigh of relief. I never spoke of what happened that night. The other nurses assumed Mr. Grayson had passed peacefully in his sleep, and I didn't correct them. How could I? They wouldn't have believed me if I told them the truth. But I knew that the shadows had come for him, that they had been waiting for him since the war, and that they had finally taken him to wherever they came from. And sometimes, late at night when the ward is silent and the shadows are long, I can still feel them, watching, waiting for me. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Michael, and I'm a nurse from New England. What I'm about to share with you is an experience that has haunted me for years. It took place in a part of the hospital known as the Forgotten Ward, a place so steeped in mystery and dread that it seemed to exist outside the realm of normal reality. The Forgotten Ward was an old section of the hospital that had been shut off from use for decades. It was a relic from an earlier era, when medical practices were more experimental and less regulated. The ward's closure came after numerous patient deaths under questionable circumstances, and it was left to gather dust and decay. Few people knew much about it, and fewer still dared to enter. It was a place of whispered legends and hushed fears, a shadowy relic that seemed to pulse with a dark history. One night, due to an unexpected staffing crisis, I was assigned to cover a shift in the Forgotten Ward. It was a grim task, but as a nurse I had always prided myself on my ability to handle any situation. I'd heard the stories about strange occurrences, mysterious noises, and the ward's reputation for being haunted. But I dismissed them as nothing more than hospital gossip and overactive imaginations. When I arrived, the ward was exactly as I had imagined it: dusty, dark, and oppressive. The air was thick with a musty, almost metallic smell, as if it hadn't been breathed in decades. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floors were covered in a thick layer of dust. The whole place felt like a tomb, frozen in time, and it was clear that it hadn't seen any real human activity for years. The few patients that had been temporarily moved to this ward were in critical condition, and their rooms were barely functional. One patient, Mrs. Thompson, stood out in particular. She was an elderly woman suffering from severe dementia, and her condition had worsened to the point where she needed constant care. She had been placed in the ward due to her inability to receive proper care elsewhere in the hospital. Her room was at the end of the long, narrow hallway, the furthest point from the ward's entrance. As I approached, the temperature seemed to drop significantly, and an unsettling chill filled the air. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows that danced along the walls. The sense of isolation was palpable, as if the ward existed in a separate dimension, cut off from the rest of the hospital. When I entered Mrs. Thompson's room, I found her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open and staring vacantly at the corner. Her gaze was fixed on something I couldn't see, and the room seemed to grow colder as I approached. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and stretch, forming indistinct shapes that flickered in and out of view. Despite my best efforts to remain calm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I checked Mrs. Thompson's vitals and adjusted her medications, trying to focus on my work. But as the hours passed, strange things began to happen. The whispers that had been faint at first grew louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the empty hallways and filling the air with an eerie, almost unintelligible murmur. The flickering lights cast eerie, elongated shadows that moved independently of any source. At one point, I noticed that the dust on the floor had been disturbed, as if someone had walked through it recently. But there was no one else on duty, and the ward had been locked and untouched for years. As the night wore on, my unease grew. The whispers became a constant presence, an almost physical sensation that pressed down on me from all sides. The shadows seemed to grow more pronounced, stretching and curling in unsettling ways. It felt as though the very walls of the ward were alive. breathing in sync with the disquieting atmosphere. I went to check on another patient, Mr. Carter, who was situated in a room halfway down the hall. His condition was stable, but when I entered his room, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of dread. Mr. Carter was sitting up in bed, his face pale and his eyes wide open. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. It was as if he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. I examined him, but physically he was stable. Yet the coldness in the room was almost unbearable, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I could feel an unseen presence pressing in on me, making it difficult to breathe. Returning to Mrs. Thompson's room, I found her still staring at the corner. The shadows there had grown more pronounced, forming a dark, shifting mass that seemed to coalesce into a vaguely humanoid shape. I could feel the air growing heavier, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Suddenly, I felt a sharp drop in temperature, and the lights flickered wildly. The figure in the shadows seemed to move, its shape becoming more defined and menacing. It was as if the shadows were trying to reach out, to pull something or someone into their dark embrace. I tried to reach Mrs. Thompson, but as I moved closer, the figure seemed to lurch toward me. A frigid breeze swept through the room, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I could barely hear myself think. The sound of the whispers blending into a cacophony of despair and anguish. In a panic, I called for assistance, but there was no response. The usual channels of communication were silent, and the ward seemed to be cut off from the rest of the hospital. It was as if the forgotten ward existed in its own dark, isolated realm. The figure in the shadows seemed to reach out toward Mrs. Thompson, its dark tendrils stretching and writhing in the air. I could feel the oppressive weight of its presence, a force of pure malevolence that seemed to sap my strength and will. I moved to shield Mrs. Thompson, standing between her and the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in on us from all sides. Mrs. Thompson's face was a mask of terror, her eyes wide and unseeing as she continued to stare at the figure. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she began to cry out in a mournful, anguished wail. The figure in the shadows seemed to retreat, the darkness swirling and dissipating. The coldness lifted slightly, and the whispers began to fade. The lights flickered back to their normal state, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, though the sense of dread remained. I stayed with Mrs. Thompson until the end of my shift, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I checked on the other patients, but the sense of unease lingered. When my replacement arrived, I handed over my duties and left the ward, my heart heavy with a mixture of relief and lingering terror. The forgotten ward was once again sealed off, the doors locked and the lights turned off. I never worked there again, and I never spoke of that night to anyone else. The experience left a deep mark on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent still lingered in the shadows of that abandoned place. The ward was eventually demolished, but the stories of its haunting presence remained. I left the hospital a few months later, but the memory of that night still haunts me. It's a reminder that some places hold on to their secrets, and that the shadows of the past can come alive in the most unexpected ways. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Joseph, and I'm a nurse from a small town in the Midwest. I've seen my fair share of strange things in my years of working in healthcare, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened during one particular night shift. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and the hospital was eerily calm. The air was thick, with a sense of unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The ward I was assigned to that night was on the top floor of the hospital, a floor that was usually reserved for long-term patients, most of whom were elderly and required constant care. The top floor was always a bit quieter than the rest of the hospital, and the shadows seemed to stretch just a little bit longer in the dim light. The patients were all asleep, and the only sounds were the faint beeping of monitors and the soft rustling of sheets. I did my rounds, checking on each patient, making sure they were comfortable and that their vitals were stable. Everything seemed normal, until I reached room 308. Room 308 was at the end of the hall, in a corner where the light from the hallway barely reached. The patient in that room was Mr. Anderson, an elderly man who had been in the hospital for months. He was suffering from a severe case of pneumonia, and his condition had been deteriorating for some time. He was a quiet man, rarely speaking, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. Despite his frail state, there was something about him that always seemed off, though I could never quite pinpoint what it was. As I approached his room, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, which was odd because I was certain I had closed it during my last round. I pushed it open slowly, peering inside. The room was dimly lit by the small lamp on the bedside table, casting long shadows on the walls. Mr. Anderson was lying in bed, his eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, and his skin was pale and clammy. I stepped inside, feeling a cold draft that didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular. The temperature in the room was noticeably lower than the rest of the ward, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I approached the bed, ready to check his vitals, but as I got closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if something, or someone, was watching me. I quickly glanced around the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The only thing that seemed out of place was Mr. Anderson's expression. His eyes were still fixed on the ceiling, but there was a look of sheer terror on his face, as if he had seen something horrifying just moments before I entered. I reached for his wrist to check his pulse, but the moment my fingers touched his skin, his hand jerked away violently. His eyes, which had been staring blankly at the ceiling, suddenly shifted to meet mine. They were wide and filled with fear, and his mouth opened as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. I tried to calm him down, reassuring him that everything was okay, but it was clear that he wasn't listening. His gaze drifted back to the ceiling, and his breathing grew more rapid. It was then that I noticed something strange. There in the corner of the room, where the shadows were the darkest, I saw a faint outline, a shape that didn't belong. It was tall and slender, almost human in form, but not quite. The figure seemed to be made of shadows, its edges indistinct and constantly shifting. It stood there, completely still, watching us. My heart began to race, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. I wanted to move, to run out of the room, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Mr. Anderson seemed to notice it too. His breathing became more labored, and he started to whisper frantically, his voice barely audible. "It's here," he rasped. "It's been watching me, waiting for me. I didn't know what to do." My rational mind told me that it was just a trick of the light, that there was nothing there, but every instinct in my body screamed that it was real. The figure remained motionless, its gaze fixed on Mr. Anderson, who was now trembling uncontrollably. Desperately, I reached for the call button to summon help, but before I could press it, the lights in the room flickered and then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the faint glow of the hallway outside. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and I could see my breath in the air. In the darkness, I could hear Mr. Anderson's labored breathing and the faint sound of something shifting in the corner. The figure was still there, but now it seemed closer, as if it had moved silently toward us while the lights were out. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, bearing down on us. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When I finally managed to switch it on, I shone the beam directly at the corner where the figure had been. But there was nothing there. The corner was empty, the shadows still, and the room was silent except for Mr. Anderson's ragged breaths. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned the flashlight toward the bed, I saw that Mr. Anderson was no longer lying still. He was thrashing violently, his eyes rolling back into his head, and his mouth foaming as he gasped for air. I rushed to his side, trying to hold him down and keep him from hurting himself, but his strength was astonishing for someone in his condition. I yelled for help, hoping someone would hear me, but the hospital remained eerily silent. The figure in the corner was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. I did everything I could to stabilize Mr. Anderson, but it was as if something was fighting me, an unseen force that was determined to take him. Just when I thought he couldn't last any longer, Mr. Anderson suddenly stopped moving. His body went limp, and his eyes slowly closed. I checked his pulse, it was weak, but still there. He had fallen into a deep, almost comatose state, and for a moment I thought the worst was over. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I heard it. A soft, barely perceptible whisper coming from the corner of the room. It was the same voice I had heard earlier, but now it was clearer, more distinct. "He's mine," it said. "He's been mine all along." I froze, my blood running cold. The figure was back, lurking just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on the corner, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and menacing. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in a silent standoff with the shadowy figure. But eventually I heard footsteps in the hallway, and the lights flickered back on. The figure vanished, leaving behind nothing but an icy chill in the air. My colleague entered the room, and I quickly explained what had happened, though I left out the part about the figure. We moved Mr. Anderson to another room, away from the shadows that had tormented him. He never regained consciousness, and he passed away a few days later. The doctors said it was his illness that took him, but I know there was something more, something that had been waiting for him in the darkness. I transferred to a different ward shortly after that night, and I've tried to put the experience behind me. But every time I walk past room 308, I feel that same cold draft, and I can't help but wonder if the silent watcher is still there, waiting for its next victim. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, my name is Deborah, and I'm a nurse from a small coastal town in New England. I've worked in healthcare for over a decade, and I've encountered more than my share of strange and unsettling experiences. But what I'm about to share with you is something that still haunts me to this day. It was a chilly autumn evening when I was scheduled for a night shift at the local hospital. The hospital itself is a bit of an old building, with creaking floors and walls that seem to echo every little sound. It's not the most modern facility, but it's where I've spent most of my career. Over the years, I've grown accustomed to its quirks, the flickering lights, the groaning pipes, the occasional cold spots that seem to appear out of nowhere. But that night, something was different. As I made my way to the hospital, I noticed that the town itself seemed unusually quiet. The streets were empty, and the usual sounds of life, dogs barking, cars passing by, were strangely absent. The sky was overcast, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if a storm was brewing, but no rain came, just that eerie stillness that seemed to settle over everything. I arrived at the hospital and headed to the geriatric ward, which was located in one of the older wings of the building. The ward was quiet, with only a few patients in their rooms, most of them asleep. As I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier than usual, and there was an odd stillness that hung in the air, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, I was making my way down the hallway when I heard it, a faint whispering sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the result of too many long shifts and not enough sleep. But as I continued down the hall, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from any of the patients' rooms, but rather from the walls themselves. I paused, listening carefully, trying to make out the words. The whispers were soft, almost too soft to hear, but there was something distinctly unsettling about them. They seemed to echo through the corridor, a constant droning murmur that sent a chill down my spine. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, speaking in a language that I couldn't understand. I continued my rounds, trying to ignore the whispers, but they persisted, growing louder and more insistent. By the time I reached Mrs. Caldwell's room, I was on edge. Mrs. Caldwell was an elderly woman with advanced dementia, and she was one of our more challenging patients. She often mumbled to herself or called out for people who weren't there, so when I heard her talking as I approached her room, I wasn't immediately concerned. But as I entered her room, I realized that something was very wrong. Mrs. Caldwell was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. She was staring at the wall opposite her bed, her mouth moving rapidly as she whispered frantically. At first, I thought she was having one of her episodes, but then I realized that she wasn't talking to herself. She was talking to the wall. I moved closer, trying to hear what she was saying. Her voice was low and urgent, her words a jumbled mess of phrases that didn't make much sense. But there was one word she repeated over and over again: listen. I gently placed my hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her down. Mrs. Caldwell, it's okay, I said softly. There's nothing there. You're safe. But she shook her head violently, her eyes never leaving the wall. They're in the walls, she whispered. They're trying to get out. You have to listen. They want you to listen. A cold shiver ran through me as she said those words. The whispering in the hallway seemed to grow louder, more intense, as if it were trying to drown out her voice. I glanced at the wall she was staring at, half expecting to see something there, but there was nothing, just the plain old plaster that had probably been there for decades. I stayed with Mrs. Caldwell for a while, trying to soothe her, but she remained agitated, her eyes darting back and forth as if she were trying to keep track of something I couldn't see. Eventually, she seemed to tire herself out, and she lay back down, still whispering to the wall as she drifted off to sleep. I left her room, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was still and silent, but the whispers were still there, faint but persistent. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept hearing Mrs. Caldwell's voice in my head, telling me to listen. The rest of the night was a blur. The whispers seemed to follow me wherever I went, growing louder in the empty corridors and quieting down when I entered a patient's room. I felt like I was being watched, like the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with some unseen energy. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I drove home in a daze, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I barely slept that day, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened. When I returned to work the next night, I was dreading going back to the geriatric ward, but I told myself it was just a bad night, that I was overreacting. But as soon as I stepped into the ward, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. I could almost make out the words, though they were still just out of reach. The patients seemed more agitated too, as if they could hear the whispers as well. Mrs. Caldwell was particularly disturbed, refusing to sleep and insisting that the walls were trying to talk to her. Over the next few nights, things only got worse. The whispers grew louder and more persistent, and the patients became increasingly unsettled. Mrs. Caldwell deteriorated rapidly, her fear and paranoia consuming her. She refused to sleep, refused to eat, and spent hours staring at the walls, muttering to herself. One night, as I was doing my rounds, I heard a loud crash from Mrs. Caldwell's room. I rushed inside to find her lying on the floor, her eyes wide open and her mouth twisted in a silent scream. She was dead. The cause was listed as a heart attack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had caused it. Something that had been whispering to her, driving her mad with fear. After Mrs. Caldwell's death, the whispers seemed to die down, but they never truly went away. I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the hospital is quiet and the shadows stretch long across the walls. I've asked other nurses if they've heard anything strange, but they just look at me like I'm crazy. I've tried to put the experience behind me, but it still haunts me. I'll never forget the look in Mrs. Caldwell's eyes, the terror that consumed her in those final days. And I'll never forget the whispers that still echo in the walls of that old hospital, waiting for someone else to listen. But this is where the story takes an even darker turn. After Mrs. Caldwell's death, the hospital administration decided to renovate the geriatric ward. They planned to tear down some of the older walls and replace them with new, modern ones. I thought that maybe, just maybe, the renovation would put an end to the strange occurrences. I was wrong. As the construction crew began their work, the whispers returned with a vengeance. They were no longer soft and distant, but loud, urgent, and impossible to ignore. The workers complained of hearing voices, of feeling watched, and of tools disappearing only to reappear in strange places. Some even refused to work in the ward, citing an overwhelming sense of dread. One day, while I was on my lunch break, I overheard a conversation between two of the workers. They were talking about something they had found behind one of the walls, something that had been hidden away for decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached them, asking what they had discovered. At first, they were reluctant to say anything, but eventually, one of them admitted that they had found a hidden room. It was small, barely big enough for a person to stand in, and it had no doors or windows. The only way in or out was through the wall they had just demolished. Inside the room, they found old medical equipment, rusted and covered in dust. There were also old patient records, dating back to the early 1900s. But the most disturbing thing they found was a series of strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that none of them could identify. The workers didn't want to talk about it any further, and I didn't press them. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the hidden room and the strange symbols. I knew I had to see it for myself. The next day, I made my way to the construction site, hoping to get a glimpse of the room before it was sealed up again. I found it easily enough, tucked away in a corner of the ward. The walls had been stripped bare, exposing the hidden room in all its eerie glory. As I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with some dark energy. I could almost feel the whispers pressing in around me, louder than ever before. I didn't stay long. The atmosphere in the room was oppressive, and I felt like I was suffocating. I left as quickly as I could, but the experience left me shaken. I knew there was something deeply wrong with that place, something that had been hidden away for decades and was now struggling to break free. The renovation was eventually completed, and the hidden room was sealed up once again. The whispers have quieted down, but I know they're still there, lurking in the walls, waiting for someone else to listen. I don't know what those symbols meant, or why that room was hidden away, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't meant to be disturbed. I've tried to move on, to forget about what happened, but the memories still linger, haunting me in the dead of night. I still work at the hospital, though I avoid the geriatric ward as much as I can. Every now and then I hear the whispers, faint and distant, as if they're calling out to me. I try to ignore them, to push them out of my mind, but they always find a way back in. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of the whispers, but I know one thing for certain: I'll never listen to them again. Thank you for joining me as we delved into these 5 chilling tales of nurse horror encounters. Each story offers a haunting glimpse into the darker side of the healthcare world, where the walls seem to whisper and shadows harbor malevolent secrets. I hope these narratives have given you a sense of the eerie and unsettling that can lurk behind even the most familiar of places. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. And if you have your own experiences or stories you'd like to share, feel free to reach out. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, sometimes the most frightening things are the ones that go unheard. Keep your lights on and your curiosity sharp. Sweet dreams, and be careful what you listen for in the dark.